And our next speaker is Justin Winters, and she has been working with Leonardo DiCaprio to personally build his impact since she was the founding executive director of the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation and now the founder and leader of the One Earth initiative. They have funded over $100 million into over 200 projects in 50 countries since they founded the foundation. I'm so grateful that Justin's here and brought with her our friend Mitch Anderson from Amazon Frontlines. But first, please join me in welcoming Justin Winters to the stage.
Thanks, Amy. Good afternoon. Great to be here. Over the past 13 years, I've had the great honor and opportunity to follow my passion and work on efforts to protect the planet, driving critical resources and to partners on the front lines, creating campaigns to inspire the public and build a global movement, and collaborating with activists, scientists, indigenous leaders, and organizations to solve the myriad of issues that we face. But over the last several years, there has been a never-ending slew of bad news for the planet. In the face of so much environmental destruction and the looming climate crisis, I, like many of you I would imagine, have found myself wondering if it is already too late. Are the forces against us just too entrenched and too powerful? Is it possible to turn this ship around? When are we too far down the path of climate change to save ourselves? Last fall, we got some alarming but very clear information from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's special report on the state of our climate. The report assessed more than 6,000 scientific papers with input from 91 authors and editors from 40 countries. They found that we are already seeing severe climate impacts, and that's with just 1 degree of temperature rise. Last year, Texas had its third 500-year flood in the span of 3 years. The past decade has been the 10 hottest global years on record. And there's a strong probability that the Arctic will be ice-free within our lifetimes. In fact, right now during the summer, you can take a cruise ship through the Northwest Passage. The report went on to say that if we allow global temperature to hit 2 degrees C, it'll be much worse than previously projected. Let me paint a picture of what a 2 degrees C world looks like. It means the collapse of the world's coral reefs. Don't forget that the coral reefs are the very nurseries of our seas. It means 3 to 10 feet of sea level rise by 2100 in some regions. It means permanent drought covering 1/4 of the Earth. And it means more than 100 million refugees fleeing from climate impacts by 2050. I don't know about you, but this is not a future that we want. And finally, the IPCC report went on to say that there's a significant risk of crossing critical thresholds and even triggering tipping points if we allow the climate to warm beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. Given this news, how does the historic Paris Climate Agreement that 190 countries signed in 2015 help us? Unfortunately, right now, it falls far short. Analysis of the commitments made under the Paris Agreement show that they will ultimately lead to a world well above 2 degrees Celsius. It's now clear that if we want life, and I mean all of life, to have a future on this planet, we simply cannot allow global temperature to rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius. Several years ago at the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, we started reaching out to experts, scientists, and thought leaders to discuss what it would take to both avert a climate crisis and ensure that our natural systems can continue to sustain life. Essentially, we wanted to know if there was a plan to save the planet and ourselves. It turns out, while there's tons of research on the problems we face and an array of amazing solutions, there wasn't a clear, scientifically backed plan showing that the crisis was indeed solvable. Originally, our focus was developing a global plan to protect nature, but you can't protect nature without also addressing climate change and making sure that humans have enough food and water to survive. It turns out that you can't solve these problems in a silo because everything is connected. We commissioned research from over 20 top climate, energy, conservation, and agriculture scientists around the world and arrived at a 3-pillar plan, a vision for the planet that we call One Earth, where protecting nature plays a critical role. It turns out that we can ensure that our global temperature doesn't go above 1.5 degrees Celsius if we achieve 3 goals by 2050. We need to transition our energy systems to 100% renewable energy. We need to protect, connect, and restore 50% of our natural ecosystems on land and sea. And finally, we need to transform our agriculture systems to regenerative and carbon-negative agriculture practices. It's an ambitious plan, but given what's at stake, what other option is there? This is the moment when all of us are being asked to step up. Through the innovative One Earth climate model, which was released a few months ago, and several other scientific efforts we commissioned, we now know that this transformation is not only scientifically possible, it is necessary if we want to prevent catastrophic climate change. Let me quickly walk you through the science. This gray bar shows what we think is the best possible outcome of the Paris Agreement, giving us a 50% shot of keeping global temperature rise under 2 degrees C, which we now know for sure isn't good enough. Here, you can see how transitioning to 100% renewable energy by 2050 would avoid about half of these CO2 emissions, which is better, but still not enough to reach the 1.5 degree goal, which is the red line at the bottom. If our natural carbon sinks represented here in the green and blue bar, the forests, the mangroves, the grasslands that absorb and sequester carbon stay intact and hold up, they'll absorb about half of these emissions, but there is still a big gap. And that's where natural climate solutions come in as the key to solving the climate crisis. By restoring degraded forests, grasslands, and wetlands, we can absorb as much as 300 gigatons of CO2. And finally, we can completely close the gap and reach the 1.5 degree goal by transforming our use of working lands through practices that draw down an additional 400 gigatons of CO2 out of the atmosphere and down into the soil. Practices like better forest management, agroforestry, silvopasture, and regenerative agriculture. These strategies are being integrated together for the first time, proving that we have the solutions to the climate crisis right at our fingertips right now. It was just a few years ago when everybody thought that powering the world by solar and wind was just a pipe dream. Well, today, 80 cities around the US and 12 countries around the world have committed to 100% renewable energy. And last year, California passed SB 100, committing California to phase out fossil fuels by 2045. This is tangible proof that we can make transformative action occur quickly. Of course, much more lies ahead in realizing a full transition to 100% renewable energy. But the second and third pillars of the One Earth plan that put nature at the center of solving the climate crisis are what we need to build massive support and momentum around. Several of the world's leading biologists, including E.O. Wilson and the Nature Needs Half Coalition, have stated that in order to prevent a mass extinction, we have to protect half the planet for nature. Half the planet. But the truth is that protecting half the planet is also the key to solving the climate crisis and ensuring that humans have a future. This past April, just before Earth Day, an important scientific paper we supported, called The Global Deal for Nature, was published in Scientific Advances. Authored by 19 leading experts, the paper lays out a science-driven plan to save life on Earth by protecting natural ecosystems that play a critical function in both storing carbon, producing fresh water, and providing food security. The paper provides the rationale for nations to protect 50% of the Earth by formally protecting 30% by 2030 and designating an additional 20% as climate stabilization areas to help the world stay below the recommended target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. The paper also states that in order to effectively protect nature at this scale, we must focus on the rights of indigenous communities to steward their lands for effective conservation. Traditional conservation measures are simply not enough. If we need to protect, connect, and restore 50% of our natural ecosystems to keep our biosphere functioning, then the question is, what 50%? Well, at One Earth, we decided to try to tackle that question. Utilizing the latest advances in remote sensing and computer modeling, and working closely with an array of conservation biologists and computer scientists, we are developing a new dynamic map called the Global Safety Net. This map depicts the world's most ecologically intact lands, along with the areas that need to be restored and connected in order to allow biodiversity to survive and thrive, water resources to be protected, and carbon sequestration to be maximized. The next 3 slides are an image progression from our initial safety net model. The dark green areas that you see here are wild and remote areas. The lighter green areas are the natural lands, including indigenous lands that have a very light human footprint and need to be kept protected from outside extractive and degrading activities like oil drilling, mining, and agriculture. All the green you see here is what we would call intact nature, but in fact, it is the life support system for the planet. This intact nature produces much of the oxygen that we breathe, ensures water supplies for 1 billion people, and absorbs 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year, more than 1/4 of the total that we produce. Without these natural lands remaining intact, we humans and much of the rest of the life on the planet would simply be toast. In this final slide, you're seeing the additional corridors that need to be created to connect habitat that's been fragmented by humans. These corridors, which in some cases are no wider than a country road, are like veins, allowing wildlife to safely move from one protected area to the next. This movement is the key to sustaining life and building resiliency in the face of climate impacts. As you can see, 50%, we need to keep 50% intacted, but it's not evenly distributed across every continent and country. There are some places, like the Amazon rainforest, that require much more protection because of its dense biodiversity and the role that the ecosystem plays in our entire biosphere's health. More than 90% of the Amazon has to be preserved. The Amazon is the world's largest carbon sink, storing and removing vast amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. And it also serves as one of the planet's most vital hydrological systems. If it becomes degraded, millions of people will lose access to water, and our climate system will be in far deeper peril. Though it's still in its early stages, I just wanted to share an initial full pass of the global safety net with you here today so that you can envision what protecting and restoring 50% of nature would look like. Once we have the full safety net model, including the oceans, it can be used to create scenarios to articulate the social and economic benefits of protecting nature at the local and national levels, showing just how important it is for people to protect our natural systems. Some people have said that we can't protect 50% because we need more land for agricultural expansion, but we believe that the exact opposite is true. We simply won't be able to feed 10 billion people unless we protect 50%. Why? Because the carbon emissions associated with losing any more of our natural lands could put us well over 2 degrees C. And if we allow global temperature rise to hit 2 degrees C, we will be faced with permanent drought in many regions, massive flooding in others, and vanishing water supplies on all 5 continents. Without water, there's no food, and without food, there's no life. But if we realize the 50% vision for nature, we can also preserve watershed ecosystems which collect and deliver water to 1 billion people. How can we feed 10 billion people on the current area under agricultural management if right now we can barely feed 7.5 billion people? Several studies show that it is indeed possible, and the solutions that make it so would not only increase the quantity of our food, but also the quality. Did you know that last year we grew enough food for 10 billion people, but because of huge inefficiencies in our food system, more than 40% of that food was wasted? We're now examining 30 strategies to increase both nutrition and food availability without increasing the footprint of agricultural lands. But here are a few of the top solutions. We have to eliminate biofuel crops. A football field of corn for ethanol powers 3 cars per year. A football field of solar panels can power nearly 300 cars. We have to reduce as much waste as possible from the global food system, and this means more locally grown food delivered to local markets. We have to cap meat production and shift to plant-based diets. There's a growing demand for meat in the developing world, which means that Americans and Europeans need to eat a lot less red meat. And we have to end overfishing. By protecting 50% of the oceans, we can ensure continued healthy populations of fish for the billions of people that depend upon seafood as a major source of nutrition. And we have to shift away from industrial-scale agriculture and prioritize smallholder farms. Small farms produce 80% of the world's nutrition, while industrial farms produce only 20% on an area twice the size. In short, small farms produce more foods. In short, we need way less monoculture. Clearly, the massive challenges we face, climate change, loss of biodiversity, feeding the world, access to water, can't be solved in a silo. The solution requires us to see the biosphere and our role in it as a complete system. Does anybody know what this map is of? Anybody? No? We're used to seeing the world divided up by country boundaries, but this is a map of the world drawn by Mother Nature. Each of the colors is a different ecoregion. In short, an area of common communities of biodiversities. In many ways, it's similar to our human maps, but from the plant and animal kingdom perspective. The ecoregions, Mother Nature's map, is the organizing principle behind the global safety net. It's vital and long overdue to respect nature's systems and use nature's map as the very basis of our plan to protect the biosphere. We worked with scientists to group these ecoregions into 190 bioregions, clusters of ecoregions that need to be thought of together if we are to move from the vision of One Earth into a global action plan. Imagine the radical collaboration and transformation that could happen. Communities, indigenous groups, organizations, government, and business working together to develop a plan to protect an adequate amount of nature in their bioregion, in tandem with developing a plan to transition to 100% renewable energy and transform the agriculture systems. At One Earth, we know that global transformation over the next decade is scientifically necessary to save life on Earth. And we believe it's entirely possible if citizens and decision makers have the tools to turn the vision into a reality. They are inspired by a vision of the world that we want to create and feel connected to tangible solutions at the community level, linking local action to global impact. All of you here today were born into this time because, in fact, you are the transformation. You have the strength and the capacity to turn hope into action. Together, and with nature at our backs, we have the power to do this. Thank you so much.
That's good.
So I'm still standing here because we're giving Amy a break, and I'm introducing the next speaker, who's Mitch Anderson, who's a longtime friend of mine. So I really can't think of a better community effort on the front lines of protecting nature that has real global implications for climate change in our future than the work of our longtime partner, Amazon Frontlines, led by my good friend, Mitch Anderson, who you'll hear from next. After several years working on a lawsuit and international campaign to hold oil giant Chevron accountable for massive environmental contamination of Ecuador's Amazon, and realizing that the lawsuit could in fact go on forever without any resolution, Mitch moved in 2011 from California to the troubled boomtown of Lago Agrio, the epicenter of oil contamination in the western Amazon, to begin a project to ensure that every indigenous family living downriver from the oil fields would have access to clean water, which, by the way, they ended up accomplishing. And from there, Mitch built Amazon Frontlines, an organization that has spent the last 8 years forging a new model of indigenous-led rainforest protection, hand in hand with indigenous youth and elders who call the Amazon their home. As I'm sure Mitch will tell you, they've had some major wins over the past few years stopping mining and oil on indigenous lands and setting landmark precedents for the region. Amazon Frontlines also provides concrete opportunities for youth to dream about the future of their people and then delivers the core capacity, the networks, and the resources for them to act on their bold ideas. Amazon Frontlines is proving that this model works for the immediate protection of indigenous homelands and for the long-term fight against climate change. Of the hundreds of organizations and leaders that I've worked with over the past decade, Mitch stands out as an exemplary leader filled with deep integrity, humility, creativity, and vision. Frankly, his type of leadership is one that the world needs much more of. I'm excited for you to learn more about his work and the powerful indigenous movement that is emerging from the heart of the Amazon rainforest.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Amy, for bringing me up here from the Amazon to speak today. What I'd like to do over the next 20 minutes is share stories, really. I'd like to share stories of some people who are very close to me, an elder, a young man, and a young woman. And through sharing these stories, I hope to bring you guys closer to the life that they live in the Amazon rainforest and hopefully inspire a shift in the way we think about this big and urgent question of how to protect the Amazon rainforest. So this is Delfin Payaguaje. He's an elder of the Secoya Nation in Ecuador's Amazon. And like indigenous elders across the Amazon, he holds the oral history of the rainforest in him, the stories that have been passed down for generations, stories that he's lived. Now each morning, at first light, Delfin rasps with the yoko vine with his old knife. And yoko is a wild woody liana that the Secoya drink each morning to share stories, to give counsel, to share their dreams, and yet to catch a buzz too, because Secoya contains caffeine and theobromine. It's like the Secoya mochaccino, but it's bitter as hell, and it purges you, and it's really good for waking up. Over a morning's chat with Delfin, he'll bring you and transport you to mythological times and to old times where shamans were fighting against freshwater whales in blackwater lagoons. He'll tell you forest fables that teach you about the nuanced morality of hunting. And he's captivated me for hours describing with the most intricate ecological detail nearly every insect, tree, frog, bird, and mammal in the forest. And sometimes when the grandkids and the great-grandkids are gathered around, he'll tell about the big events in his life, which are also like the chapters of Amazon resource extraction. How the rubber tappers invaded when he was a young man, bleeding the trees for latex to supply the war efforts in Europe, and how he escaped on a dugout canoe. How the missionaries arrived with their TV sets with the devil and hellfire inside of them. The first time he saw a chainsaw and shuddered at the destruction it would cause. The first oil well drilled in the upper Amazon by the American company Texaco, and how the river ran black for weeks, and on and on and on. Several years ago, a team of ethnobotanists did a comparative study on indigenous plant knowledge, and Delfin accompanied them. And he was able to identify in his own language, Paincoca, names and uses for over 1,000 plants, flowers, roots, resins, barks, and vines. A year later, in that same patch of forest, a Chinese oil company conducted an environmental impact assessment that identified only 5 tree species of economic or medicinal value. And of course, the company based their economic compensation offer to the Secoya people off of that pitiful assessment of forest value. And luckily, that project has not got off the ground. Delfin is an Amazonian shaman, which means he drinks ayahuasca, the hallucinogenic forest brew. But more importantly, it means he has a deep knowledge of life in the Amazon. He can walk into one of the most mysterious and complex ecosystems on our planet and literally turn it into a pharmacy. He can turn it into a hardware store. He can turn it into a market. He can turn it into a place of worship. He can turn it into his home. And on one of the many mornings that I've drank yoko with Delfin, he told me, and I think this should be, one of the 500 wisest quotes in the world. The more you know about the forest, the more value it has. That's why the outsiders cut it down, because they don't know enough. Now, the Amazon rainforest is approaching a devastating and well-documented ecological tipping point. One of our Earth's largest carbon sinks behind the oceans will be turned into savanna by the end of this century if we don't staunch the bleeding now. The driver of this deforestation is a global economic system premised on the extraction of natural resources. We are literally bleeding dry the heart pump of the world, a rainforest that produces 20% of our oxygen, 20% of our fresh water, and contains 10% of all species on Earth. For petroleum, gold, hardwoods, palm oil, soy, and beef. The Amazon is also racing towards a less well-known yet equally devastating cultural tipping point. The acceleration of forest loss from oil roads, monocrops, and mining is threatening indigenous people's way of life and their ability to survive off the abundance of the land. The Amazon's most experienced guardians are being surrounded by destruction, and it's taking a devastating toll on their lives, their cultures, and their forest. For Delphine and elders that I've met across the Amazon, this is one of their greatest fears, that the youth, the next generation of indigenous leaders, will be forced to abandon traditional practices to find work in the very industries that are threatening their forests, that they will forget the stories, who made them who they are, that they will depend on the town pharmacies to heal themselves instead of the natural pharmacy in their backyard, and that as the forest erodes, so will their language and their connection to the land. That instead of drinking Yoko at first light, they will wake up drinking Nescafe and put on the company overalls and head out for a day's work cutting down the very forest that gave birth to their culture. Because as Delphine said, they don't know enough. It's an African palm plantation there. All right, so I'd like to introduce you now to a dear friend of mine, Kofan youth, Alex Lusitante, who sees this dire reality clear as day, and he knows the stakes. Alex grew up in one of the most lush and biodiverse rainforests on Earth, the Andean Amazon foothills in Ecuador, a place where the cold, clear water rushes down the stony mountains into the immense Amazon basin. But unlike his father and his grandfather, Alex never knew a time before the oil companies and the miners and the loggers. He grew up with one foot in the forest and one foot in the city. He grew up at his home along the San Miguel River wearing his traditional tunic and jaguar tooth necklaces and speaking his language, Ainge. For school, he would put on his government uniform, cross the river by canoe, and walk down the gravel road past cattle ranches and oil fields, entering into the world of the Cucama, the outsider, the Spanish speakers. Alex is now 26 years old. He has a wife and 3 kids, and he is practicing to be a shaman, like his father. He keeps a strict diet, stays away from alcohol, and is learning how to sing the ancient healing songs. But he also has a dream of being a lawyer, because he says, aren't lawyers the shamans of the outside world? Let me explain. Several years ago, there was an invasion of poachers, loggers, and gold miners in the remote mountainous forests of a neighboring Kofan community at the base of the Andes Range. The youth of the Kofan community were spending more time in the city than in the forest, and they weren't paying heed to the warnings of the elders that their land was being invaded. Alex organized an ayahuasca ceremony with his father, bringing the elders and youth together. And I'm not going to fall into the trap of trying to explain what happens during a ceremony, but what I know is what happened afterwards. Alex and the youth of the village decided that they needed eyes in the forest 24 hours a day. And so we worked together on a plan to place dozens of camera traps along the logging and poaching trails and to fly drones over the rivers and creeks, documenting the evidence of illegal miners. After 18 months of land patrols, evidence gathering, more ayahuasca ceremonies, and the execution of a plan to forcibly remove intruders, we were able to bring the rate of illegal invasions down from dozens per month to nearly 0. But a new threat emerged that would require the more mysterious power of the written word of the law. And this time the foe would be the government. Without consulting the Kofan people, the Ministry of Environment, who should be responsible for protecting the forest, and the Ministry of Mining granted 52 industrial-scale gold concessions upriver from the Kofan people. Alex, who had been training with our legal team for the last year, led an evidence-gathering mission and helped build out the community response. There was the risk of mercury contamination in fish, deforestation and loss of game, soil contamination, the clogging of freshwater creeks, and the important fact that the Kofan's legal rights had been violated. Alex worked with our legal team, literally looking over their shoulder as they wrote up the lawsuit, pointing out important cultural and historical details about the threatened rivers, about the Kofan way of life. And the Kofan struggle to protect the river from gold mining became emblematic across the country. And in the end, we won a monumental victory, shutting down 52 gold mining concessions, protecting 79,000 acres of primary forest, and setting an important precedent to protect rivers from mining across the country. And when all is said and done, the spark came from the young shaman lawyer, Alex Lusitante, who just wouldn't allow the younger generation to forget where they came from. He brought them closer to the land, built up their self-esteem, and turned the tension between the old ways and the new ways into a powerful advantage for his people. A sacred vine brought them together. Technology gave them eyes in the forest. And the law? Well, the Kofan were able to use it like the shamans used their songs, to heal, and to protect. And it's an honor to say as well that Alex has just enrolled in his first year of law school, where he is studying land rights and human rights and learning how to do his homework as if it were a shamanic diet. He plays the guitar really well, too. All right, the fate of the Amazon rainforest and consequently our climate hinges on whether or not indigenous peoples like the Kofan can continue to protect their lands and cultures from a growing wave of existential threats. As the owners of approximately 1 million square miles of primary rainforest across the basin, indigenous peoples are in a powerful position to permanently protect more than a quarter of the entire Amazon rainforest. That's nearly 10 times the size of California. International law recognizes indigenous peoples' rights to free, prior, and informed consent over any decision that affects their territories or cultures, making them the only people who have the legal power to stop government-sponsored industrial deforestation at such scale. They literally have the right to say no. Recent studies, including the Extinction Report and the UN Climate Report, show that despite intensifying pressure, indigenous lands are still the best managed and the healthiest on the planet. And in the Amazon, indigenous territories fare 8 times better than non-protected areas in terms of deforestation rates, and significantly better than government-run national parks. But there's a big problem. The story of Alex and the victory of the Kofan community against mining is the exception, not the rule. A century-long history of conquest and colonization has stacked the cards against indigenous peoples, producing devastating inequalities across Amazonian countries, and leaving the Amazon's oldest guardians under-resourced and without the capacity or networks needed to effectively exercise their rights in the face of government manipulation, legal loopholes, and powerful economic agendas. They are literally being relegated to the sidelines in decisions that affect their forests, their cultures, and our shared climate. I'd like to introduce you now to Nemonte Nkimo, who is leading her people in a battle to protect their lands from oil drilling and decide the future of their forest homeland. Nemonte is a Waorani woman, and her name means many stars. She's the first female elected leader of her people, and she's also my partner. We have a 4-year-old daughter together, whose name is Daime, which means rainbow in her mom's language. Daime was born in a Waorani village in a rainforest slated to be auctioned to the international oil industry. When she was born, Nemonte cured her with forest plants and sang to her to make her a guerrera de la selva, a warrior of the jungle. And I tried to make myself useful as a new father and just generally keep up with my hunter-harvester in-laws. Yeah. I could obviously speak for hours about Nemonte and Daime, but there are time limits. So I met Nemo in 2014 when she joined a team of indigenous youth from different nations who were working together with me on building access to clean water for indigenous villages affected by oil contamination. Nemonte comes from a 500,000-acre mountainous and roadless forest, untouched by industry. So you can imagine what an impactful experience it was for her to uproot her life and move to a part of the Amazon that had been ravaged by pipelines and oil wells. As she coordinated the water project installation, she was also learning for the first time and deeply about what life looks like for indigenous peoples and the forest downriver from the oil fields. She couldn't stand the smell in the air, the fumes of the gas flares. She witnessed a pipeline rupture that poured nearly 1 million gallons of crude oil into the Kofan, Siona, and Sequoia people's principal fishing river. And she saw the government and the oil company's response. A care package for each family consisting of 5 gallons of cooking oil, 10 gallons of water, 5 cans of tuna, a bag of rice, a bag of lentils, and some candy for the kiddos. She thought of her family back home, the fresh air, the waterfalls, the rich soil for gardening, the plentiful fish in the river, and wildlife in the forest. She had a dream that her land was on fire, and she told me, "We need to bring the nations together. I need my people to see what oil will do to them and everything they love." Several years earlier, in 2012, the Ecuadorian government had arrived unannounced via Cessna plane into the villages of Nemonte's homeland. They told the villagers that their lands were now part of an oil block, and the government was planning on selling the rights to drill for oil to the highest bidder. In exchange, the government would give the Waorani schools and medical clinics. Most of the villagers weren't even present for these meetings, as they'd already gone off fishing, hunting, and gardening for the day. And according to testimony that would later be presented in court, most villagers didn't even grasp what was happening. And some even thought the document they were signing was an attendance sheet to receive lunch, not an acknowledgement that they had been consulted in the selling of their lands. The visit lasted no longer than an hour. Later, the Waorani would learn that the government attempted to auction their lands, the newly created oil block, but failed because of bottomed out oil prices and bad negotiations. But Namonte knew that soon the government would reopen the auction and her people would need to be ready. She brought the elders and the youth of her homeland to visit the Kofan, Sion, and Sequoia people in Ecuador's oil-ravaged northern Amazon to see and hear firsthand the impacts of industrial-scale operations in a tropical forest. On these visits, the elders shared stories about the disappearance of wildlife, about the poison creeks, about conflict in the community, about sickness, about the sudden need for money to survive. And listening to this, the Waorani elders vowed to never let oil in their lands. We live in a big territory, they said, and the government wants to turn it into money, poisoning our rivers and the minds of our youth. The Waorani proposed to create a territorial map of the forest that could show the world how they are connected with their lands and how there is no room for oil drilling in their forest. They spent 3 years creating maps that contain over 10,000 GPS points illustrating places of spiritual, historical, and daily importance, such as waterfalls, ancient burial grounds, centuries-old fruit orchards, animal reproductive grounds, hunting trails, gardens, medicinal plants, fishing holes, and thousands of clear water creeks flowing into the Curaray River. As predicted, in 2018, the government once again announced plans to auction off Block 22, but the Waorani were ready. The mapping of their lands had brought them together. They called a series of urgent region-wide assemblies, and my team at Amazon Frontlines helped them design an advocacy and legal strategy that could leverage the power of stories on social media, reach national and international press, and that could take advantage of Ecuador's progressive constitution and the international rights guaranteed to indigenous peoples. And so we went to battle in the court and in the court of public opinion to demonstrate that the government had violated the Waorani people's right to self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent, the right to decide what happens in their homeland. Namonte and the Waorani galvanized indigenous peoples from across the country to join them in the streets, and the leadership of the Waorani women in this battle to protect the Amazon from destruction captivated the imagination of Ecuadorian society and millions of people across the world. Despite a campaign of oil industry media pressure and reported attempts by the government to backchannel the outcome of the case, just 2 weeks ago, the Ecuadorian courts ruled in favor of the Waorani people, effectively shutting down the oil auction, protecting 500,000 acres of pristine forest from oil drilling, and setting a monumental precedent for other indigenous nations across the upper Amazon to do the same. I tell you these stories of Delphine, Alex, and Namonte because to me their stories and their struggles are what saving the Amazon rainforest is all about. Delphine's knowledge about how to live well in the forest, Alex's mission to take advantage of the best of both worlds to protect his people's lands and cultures, Namonte's struggle to level the playing field and make sure that indigenous peoples can decide their own fate. Saving the Amazon rainforest must be about more than protecting nature. It must be about defending and upholding a way of life that protects and coexists with nature. Indigenous peoples never poison their own fisheries or clear-cut their hunting grounds. They've defended the Amazon against innumerable waves of resource extraction for centuries with proven results. They are the collective owners of nearly 35% of the entire basin, and it's some of the healthiest forests in the entire rainforest in terms of wildlife populations, biodiversity, and forest cover. Large-scale environmental efforts all recognize the importance of the Amazon in fighting climate change and biodiversity loss. But when you look deeply at mainstream environmental efforts to save the forest, whether they are debt for nature swaps, carbon trading, protected areas, huge land buys, government enforcement mechanisms, at their very essence, they are all attempts at saving nature from ourselves. And how far will that get us? Indigenous-owned forests are the best managed and best protected on the planet precisely because indigenous peoples live in them, not because there is a fence around them. Big conservation efforts have failed to invest time and energy in actually understanding the perspectives of indigenous peoples and how to best, most effectively support them in their ongoing struggles in this changing world of the 21st century. And that has to change because we aren't going to protect this forest, protect our climate, and stave off the sixth great extinction by buying up land or arming police to protect wild places. We are going to do it by transforming the way we live on our planet, and we should start by listening and learning and supporting the urgent struggles of indigenous peoples. And that's what we've been doing at Amazon Frontlines over the last 8 years, learning how to listen to indigenous folks and how to partner with them in lasting and meaningful ways. And together we've come up with a model and a plan to build power with indigenous people so they can protect a way of life that protects the Amazon and saves our climate at the same time. And what that looks like is ensuring first that they can get control of their lands. We're working across Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia to secure land title to millions of acres of primary forest, and we're building out a model of land patrols that combines bottom-up organizing, traditional forest knowledge, and cutting-edge technology to halt illegal invasions and staunch the bleeding of forest loss through real-time monitoring now. But indigenous nations across the Amazon also need the networks, the capacity, and the resources to keep control of their lands. And we're doing this by empowering young organizers and rights defenders to work with their people to upend bad laws and close legal loopholes, push for good laws through strategic litigation and hard-hitting advocacy, and build the capacity to govern their lands and exercise their rights. The Waorani victory is an example of the kind of impact that's possible. Namonte just returned from a meeting at the United Nations in Geneva, and next week I'll be returning to the Amazon to participate in a historic Waorani-led Indigenous Congress, where we'll be discussing how to leverage their victory and the historic precedent to support 7 neighboring indigenous nations across Ecuador in protecting 7 million acres more of their lands that are still on the auction block. And so if there are any donors in the room, we're going to need resources to scale this. And finally, alternatives and solutions are needed because life can't be about fighting and resisting and defending all the time. It must be about thriving and living well. And so part of our strategy for long-term protection is to support indigenous peoples to thrive in their lands. And to that end, we focus on providing concrete opportunities for youth to dream about the future of their peoples, and then we deliver the core capacity, the networks, and the resources for them to act on their ideas. And what does that look like? We've built an organizing center in the Upper Amazon that serves as a leadership school and incubator, where brilliant ideas are designed, developed, and implemented, such as clean water systems for villages affected by oil contamination, solar energy in roadless villages, women's-led economic cooperatives and enterprises, journalism trainings in the jungle, education initiatives, and ecotourism. Together with our partners, we've developed a model to strengthen indigenous power that's working, and it's going to need to scale. Because for the first time in all of human history, we are all implicated in one giant planetary problem, the climate crisis. And even though the people of Western civilization might think we have the solution, I think it's important to remember what Delphine says. We just might not know enough. Thank you.